If you're about to buy a flat in the UK, you're going to want to watch this video. As a flat owner myself, I am going to be sharing the good, the bad, and the very ugly that even involved a drug dealer living in my property. And let's just say, buying and selling a flat has been a wild ride for myself, and I really wanted to be so transparent. I wanted to share the good and the bad from someone who's actually owned a flat in the UK, and I think that's really important to know. There's lots of things online about people showing pros and cons, but until you've actually been through the process and lived it yourself, I can share some of the hidden things estate agents won't tell you and the things you won't find on Google unless you land on my blog. So if you're about to buy a flat and you want to know a little bit more, let's get into the video. So before we start with the pros and cons, I just want to make it clear what a flat actually means. And other terms, you may have heard a flat called a leasehold property. Now, a leasehold property basically just means you own a lease agreement with the freeholder. You don't actually own a brick or the property, whereas with a house, which is called a freehold, although some houses can be known as a leasehold as well, a freehold basically means you own the property outright. Obviously you have your mortgage, but you don't have a lease agreement like you do with a flat. And this is a really important thing to remember: you don't own a brick with a flat. Okay, so now we've got that covered, let's get started with the pros. I really want to start this video on a high, and I do want to share that there can be some positives to owning a flat. Now, hitting it off at number one, flats are generally more affordable than houses. I mean, it was definitely true in my case. If you're a first-time buyer, if you're a single buyer on your own, flats can sometimes be the only way to get onto the property ladder. Now, a one-bed flat is considerably cheaper than a two-bed house, and in my eyes, it feels slightly more attractive than a one-bed house, because a one-bed house, you might as well just have a flat without all the additional maintenance that comes with it. But yeah, one-bed flats are generally much cheaper, easier to get onto the property ladder, and you don't need so much of a deposit. In terms of affordability, if you're on a single salary, it sometimes is the only way you can get onto the property ladder, and this is definitely true for a lot of people in the UK, where rising house prices and inflation are taking place. And again, in London, flats are still a very, very popular form of accommodation if you want to buy. Now, modern apartment blocks can also be so much more secure than a house, and when I was living on my own, this was definitely true. I didn't want entry and exit points and loads of windows to worry about. I was in a property with 4 other flats. It was so secure. We had an intercom system, so if anyone rang, we could see who they were, and no one could come into the main entrance door unless someone let them in. So it was really secure, and in modern apartment blocks, you do have that additional level of security and give you a really good peace of mind. And if you are living on your own or worried about safety, it can be a better alternative to living in a house. Now, it really is personal preference, but having a flat can be a lot easier to manage. You don't have a garden space typically, so you've got none of that maintenance to worry about, and because you do pay a service charge, any maintenance surrounding the property or through the property, like the communal hallways, is covered. The cleaning is done for you, or it should be, through your whoever your freeholder is or managing company, so the cleaning is taken care of. If something happens with the door, the roof, your service charge that you're paying for goes towards that, and you typically have a managing agent that takes care of everything, so you really don't have to lift a finger outside of your 4 walls in your flat. Now, the only upside that I will say to having a leasehold property is that when you have a house and it's a freehold property, you own everything to do with it, from the roof down to the concrete structure of the house and the path out the front and everything. So if something goes wrong, majorly wrong, like a roof leaking, you will have to fork out £15,000 or more to sort that roof from your own money. However, with a flat, you pay into your service charge. You will have a sinking fund, or you should do, that gets put aside, and essentially if there is a big issue with the property, if a roof does need fixing, the managing agents can call on that sinking fund and they can use that towards a roof leak. See, if there is no sinking fund that comes into your service charge, this may be given as an extra charge on top of your service charge. However, in terms of sorting the problem, the managing agent holds the responsibility to do that, and your service charge should essentially cover any major works like that. Whereas with a house, you don't have the freedom of it, and you often have to get the work sorted and paid for up front. And another thing about flats is sometimes they can be a little bit easier to sell than houses, in the fact that there are always buy-to-let investors, Airbnb hosts out there looking for properties that they can let out to people, and they can do Airbnb rentals for, that are in a really desirable location. So if your flat is in a desirable location, you're really onto a winner. It was definitely true for the flat that I had. I was in an Airbnb hotspot by the sea in Plymouth, and actually 3 of the other flats in my property were Airbnbs as well. So if you pick a flat in a desirable location, you're already off to a winning start, because you know people are still going to be interested in that property years down the line. So location is really important. Buying a 1-bed flat in a not desirable location is a completely different story to getting one in a desirable location, and that's something that I will come on to in a moment when we start talking about cons. And really, if you like everything managed for you, you don't want to have to care about maintenance, you don't want a garden to look after, a flat really can be a great choice. It's still one of the only ways that many people can get onto the property ladder, and I'm never ever going to criticize people that choose to buy a flat. I had one, that was all that I could afford, but I think it's really important to be very transparent and open about the disadvantages of owning a flat and the things you really need to be aware of before you sign the contract. So let's get started with the cons, and I am really sorry, but these are going to be a little bit longer than the pros that I just spoke about. Now, with a leasehold, you own a lease essentially. Your lease ranges in years, okay? So your lease could be anything from 1 year left to 999 years if it was a brand new lease. Now, generally speaking, the longer your lease, the better it is. You do not want to be having a property, you do not want to be buying a flat that has less than 100 years on the lease, because you're ever getting closer to that 90 years when you're gonna need to start doing a lease extension. Now, when your lease gets to 80 years, something called marriage value comes into play, and the shorter your lease becomes, the more expensive it will cost to renew your lease. And essentially, you can obviously let your lease run down to 0 years, but if you do that, the freeholder will take back your property, and this just goes into the fact that you do not own your property, you do not own your flat, you only own a lease agreement. So it's really important that you don't ever let that happen. Lease extensions can be ridiculously expensive. When I was having to look at this when I was doing, when I was selling my property, we're talking, you know, 10-15 grand plus, and it can really vary depending on who your managing agent is and what they charge. So if you are buying a flat, make sure that that information is provided to you by the estate agent. If you do have a really long lease, then there shouldn't be any issues with it, but remember, try and look for leases that are over 100 years, because I don't want you to get to that 90-year point when you're going to have to start looking at lease extensions and you're suddenly going to have to fork out a lot of money. Now, the crazy thing about affordability when you're trying to get a mortgage is that most mortgage lenders will say that you're not able to borrow on a house because it's too expensive. However, with a flat, you don't just have your mortgage payment, you have other payments on top, which once you add them all up, it suddenly becomes more than if you had a mortgage on a house. So with your flat, you have your mortgage payment, you'll have your service charge. So your service charge is something that is organised on a yearly basis, but you may be able to pay it monthly depending on who your managing agent is. Your service charge can range so vastly, it totally depends who your managing agent is. For me, our service charge was around 1,500 to 2,000 a year, but if you have things like lifts in the building or anything that needs lots of servicing, then your service charges are going to be a lot higher. Now, there is a block of flats in Plymouth that I know for a fact the service charge is around 6,000 a year, and it's going to be even more in places like London, where lots and lots of apartments have to be serviced and looked after. So you've got that huge cost to think about, and you also have your ground rent. Now, the ground rent doesn't actually go towards anything, it just goes to the landlord, and it's essentially to just secure your lease. So ground rent can vary as well, and we'll come on to how this can cause a lot of difficulties when purchasing and selling a flat. My ground rent was £250 a year, which generally isn't actually that much money, but it will cause problems with your lenders. But your ground rent is something you have to pay each year, and if it's not something that you pay and you fall into arrears, again, the landlord can take your property away from you. Now, ground rent, I just want to mention here, is one of the biggest problems with selling any leasehold property right now. I don't know when it came in, I'm thinking it came in around just before lockdown, but ground rent wasn't ever an issue when I purchased my flat. It was £250 a year, and that was that. It was only when I became selling the property that the issue reared its ugly head. Now, any ground rent that's over £250 outside of London, it falls into something called an AST, which is an assured short hold tenancy. And this essentially means that if you fall into arrears of your ground rent and you don't pay it on time, the landlord can take your property away from you. And this understandably causes a lot of concern for lenders, because it would mean that they would end up with nothing after lending you all of that money. And I sold my property back in 2021, but since then the issue has become even more widespread. It's affecting people that have ground rents of £150. It's affecting people that have rising increases of ground rent, and that's also something to mention as well. Your lease will pertain how your ground rent increases. So mine, for example, was it increases at the rate of RPI every 10 years. It can be fixed amounts every 10 years. It just, again, it varies on your lease. So that is something that mortgage lenders will be looking at quite heavily as well. And the alternative when you're trying to sell or you're trying to purchase is your mortgage lender is not going to lend on it anymore. I was able to sell with an indemnity policy, but I know that a lot of lenders aren't accepting that now, and instead people are having to go down the deed of variation route and also lease extension route. A lease extension route is more favourable. It will add 90 years to your existing lease, and it's also going to reduce your ground rent to a peppercorn or a nominal fee such as £1. So lease extensions are great, but again, as I already mentioned, they cost thousands and thousands of pounds, so it can become unattainable for a seller or even a purchaser if people are wanting to sort of balance the cost between one another. And one thing I will mention here is that the leasehold reform was meant to happen back in sort of lockdown time. It's now been parked until November this year. It may introduce some features to benefit a leaseholder where ground rent might be reduced or capped, but there is nothing to be seen of that yet, so I really can't comment on that. But as it stands, ground rent is a huge issue for people buying and selling flats. So again, if you are in the process of buying right now, make sure your estate agent gives you that information, because if you get into the process later down the line with your solicitors, it's going to cause a huge delay. Lease extensions and deed variations can take some months to complete, depending on the managing agent that you're dealing with. And going back to service charges, just like ground rent can increase over the years. This will be laid out in your lease. Service charges account for literally everything from the stamps that the managing agent uses to send the invoices to your house, notice boards in the hall, cleaning, guttering. They will usually account for anything and everything at the start of the year, whether that service is used in the property or not. So they essentially say that anything that isn't used in that budget for the year, they will hold back. Enough about the boring legal stuff, although that is so important. It's the most important things you need to listen to in this video and remember when you're buying a flat. But of course, you do need to be more mindful about other things, such as where your flat is positioned. I was in a very desirable location. I was really lucky where I purchased because I knew it would have a really good resale value. However, if you are sandwiched between two flats, you need to be mindful of noise. I could constantly hear a child running back across the floor on a Saturday and a Sunday, and it was so noisy. And obviously things like carpet and rugs can help, but you know, a lot of people don't want to speak to the neighbours. As I found out, I was unfortunately had a drug dealer above me, and there were lots of police calls, and it was just awful. And when you're in that position, that is your home. You're essentially sharing your home with other people that you don't necessarily know, and that's a really big thing to remember when you have a flat. You just cannot help or know who your neighbours are going to be, and it can cause your life to be a misery if they turn out to be really bad, which mine did. Luckily they went after 3 months, but yeah, it was a really difficult time, and I think that is one thing people don't think about in flat. And also, I was in a property that had 3 other Airbnb properties. Now, a lot of lenders won't allow you, or leases will allow you to rent out on an Airbnb basis. But because there were Airbnb properties, we had people coming and going at literally every goddamn hour. They were noisy. We had people being sick out the front from nights out, and it was just not nice. It never felt like my home, and it's really difficult because there's nothing you can do about it unless your lease says that Airbnb hosts aren't allowed. And one other thing that I want to mention that's really important is generally flats are more difficult to sell than houses, especially if you have a 1-bedroom flat. The market for people that want to purchase that is going to be so much slimmer than, say, a 2-bedroom flat or a house. And that's because it doesn't give you any room to grow as a family. It's only really sort of suitable for first-time buyers who are single, living on their own, or in a couple. But really the window is a lot smaller. There will be some obviously buy-to-let investors that might want to choose the flat, but houses are so much easier. And it also comes down to selling time. Flats take so much longer to go through than houses. I mean, houses can typically lead 2 to 3 months. Flats can be so much longer because of the information that comes in the lease and the questions that will undoubtedly go back to and from solicitors and the purchaser. And for my own flat, it took 5 months for the process to go through, but it can be so much longer if you need to do deed of variations and lease extensions, and this can run into a 6-month, 12-month, and even longer than a year process if you want that flat to go across the line. So guys, those are the pros and cons of owning or owning a lease agreement for a flat in the UK. And it's really good to balance the pros and cons. What is suitable for yourself and your personal individual situation? Is it all you can afford at the moment? Can you stretch to a house in maybe a 6 months or a year time? And also just be mindful about the legal implications. Ground rent, service charges and leases is really important to look at with your estate agent and solicitor. And if you're ever in doubt, walk away from it. Flats can be really, really stressful, but I don't speak for every single flat in the UK. There is probably some really, really good managing agents out there and some flats that have great leases and very low service charges and ground rents. But you do need to be mindful that leaseholders are not favoured at all by the government and from landlords. I was owning a flat as a single person on a single salary, and as the service charges kept increasing and the invoices kept coming through the door, it became a real worrying concern for me, and I was suddenly paying more than my house mortgage is right now. And it can be really, really scary if you're on your own and they just send demands if you haven't made your payment, and they sometimes set 30-day payments and you've got no choice but to pay it. I don't ever want anyone to get into that situation, so I just want you to be armed with the knowledge of what owning or buying a flat in the UK can actually bring, and always seek more information if you need it. I've linked some of my really useful blog posts in the description below about leasehold property, and I've also linked to my other video on why I would never ever buy a leasehold property again. So if you are buying a flat or you want to buy a flat, you're considering it, please head over to that video next, because it's full of so much more of what happened during my flat buying process. But I hope you enjoyed watching today's video, and if you enjoyed it, please do give it a thumbs up, and I look forward to seeing you soon.